welcome to the Revenue Insights podcast. Today, I'm joined by Sunne Kumaar. He's the Global Vice President of Sales at ServiceNow. Sunne has 30 years of experience in the technology space, leading large business units with P&L and sales responsibilities at ServiceNow, Salesforce, Accenture, and more. Sunne, it's great to have you on the podcast.
Thank you, Lee. My pleasure.
So, first things first, I'd love to know a little bit more about your story and give us some insight on, your 30-year career and how you've got to where you are today.
Yeah, no, great. First of all, once again, thank you for having me. Great to be here. I'll condense this very quick. So I grew up in India, and then I moved to the US about 30 years ago, 28 years ago, and worked for several companies, including Ernst & Young, Accenture, Fujitsu, so on and so forth. Also lived in Australia for a couple of years. So grew up in India, lived in the US, lived in Australia, did a lot of work in Europe. And pretty much my career has been in sales and sales leadership. I have had opportunities to run P&L businesses. And along the way, like we were talking pre-show, a lot of scars in the back and some good insights and some good wins along the way. But all in all, it's been a fantastic journey. And currently, as you said, I'm at ServiceNow leading global sales for our company.
Amazing. And I think the scars in the back is what I'm really intrigued to dig into during our conversation today. So something that we were really talking about during the pre-show that I'd love to dive into a bit more is around this concept of mental models now, and how you apply those to your teams. Now, I think we should begin with probably just defining what a mental model is for anyone that isn't aware of it. So I'll leave that to you, actually, if that's all right.
No, thank you, Lee. So the way I think about mental models are they're a guidepost, a map. And the reason is the following, which is sales there's a lot of art and a lot of science. And what we try to do is if we look at certain mental models, which are really maps and almost like guideposts, it provides us some principles. They're not laws, but just principles and guidelines. And they help us fast track the process and make sure that we learn from some of the lessons from the past, like we talked about the scars in the back, and to optimize, because we have a limited number of weeks. There's 52 weeks in a year, 13 weeks in a quarter, limited resources, budget. So how do we optimize all of that and make sure we get to the end result in the most optimized way? And that's what mental models does for us. And the way we think about that is there's mental models across various sciences. If you look at physics, chemistry, mathematics, philosophy, biology, neurosciences, economics, psychology, and there's all these different sciences. To bring some of that into revenue and sales is something of a personal passion of mine that developed over years and through a lot of mistakes, trials and errors. And that's really what's given us, something to look forward. And these are not rocket sciences. You and I talked about a lot of these things are very obvious, but once you put a tag to it and once you have a method, it's almost like driving to a certain destination. You've got a map, you've got certain ways you can get around it. If there are some obstacles, you can go around it. And that's what mental models does for us, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And I think to contextualize it, it'd be great if you could share an example of perhaps one mental model that really stands out to you as that's really changed the way that you've run your teams.
Yeah, there are several, and we'll talk about a few in our course of our discussion. One of them that comes to mind is which we leveraged from Six Sigma. Back in the 60s and 70s, with Toyota started the whole movement around minimizing errors and looking at root causes. So there's something called the 5 Whys, WHY. So the idea is 5 is not a magic number, but the idea is as you go and peel the onion, ask more and more and more questions, you get to the root cause. That was how the Six Sigma process was designed, which is asking multiple questions at each level, uncovering more and more and more. And finally, when you find the root cause and you fix it, a lot of the follow-on effects really become better. The way we'd look at that and you leverage that in sales is, I'll give you a very simple example. Let's say there is a deal that we're working on, and you say, okay, we're going to close this quarter. Why? Because the answer is yes, there is a compelling event at the client. Beautiful. Question is, why is that a compelling event? Oh, because they have to start the project this quarter in order to go live in June. Next question is, why do they have to go live in June? The answer may be, yeah, because their old system is being decommissioned. Beautiful. Why is the old system being decommissioned? Why is that important? Oh, because their system is going to run out of support. They're going to pay $10 million in fines and all of the late fees and stuff. That's a compelling event. So now you see, we started from a compelling event that says it has to close this quarter, which is more from our point of view, to now we're getting into the real reason, which is, there is a penalty if the project doesn't go live, the client's got issues, so on and so forth. Very simple example, but similarly in any of the deal cycles, the more and more questions we ask, we're able to uncover more and more of the actual reasons. And in some cases, there may be some things we can do ahead of time. Like in this case, we can go do some business value analysis. We can provide the client a roadmap to get from here to our journey, our project, go live, so on and so forth. And that's sort of how those questions really get us to not just the answers, but a lot of times the ability to do things that'll help us land that specific deal.
I'm really intrigued to know, with that in mind, how do you build that into what your teams are doing? Because obviously at ServiceNow, I mean, I'm not sure quite the size of the teams that you have. Do you have to build that into like your processes and your ways of working?
Yeah, I think the better questions lead to better answers, right? So it's always about the asking the questions that will help us get to the next step. And it just is something we've ingrained this over years and years of doing work, because it's really impossible for every leader to get into the ins and outs of every single deal. But the idea is, if you have a foundation, that's why mental models really and framework really helps, is if you're asking all of those specific questions, the 5 whys, for example. Again, 5 is just a number, right? It can be 6 or 7 or 4. But the more and more we're asking the questions to get to the end state, and what that helps build a mutual close plan, right? And that mutual is very important, because a lot of times we have close plans. But if it's not mutually agreed by us and the client, and it doesn't depend which company, but any company, that's one of the challenges we see, is a lot of people have plans, close plans, which is inside out. It's their plan. But has that been vetted with the client? Has the client agreed with actions, dates, and owners? Right? When we have all of those locked in, that's, again, the power of questions, is that forces us, as in our company and our team, to go in and have those discussions with the client, sometimes uncomfortable, because you're now putting names and actions to the client on the client side. But you need that, because the deal doesn't get closed by one side. It takes 2 to tango. And so when we get to that framework, or not framework, but we get to that mutual close plan as an example, do all the dates work out exactly as they are? Most likely no. But the fact that now you have names associated with tasks, associated with dates, really puts onus on both sides and creates a lot of, fills a lot of gaps. Because otherwise, if you think about it, just if we have a close plan, it's happy years, right? We love it. It's great. It's beautiful. But there is no commitment from the client. Maybe in principle there is, but unless you put it down on paper, when we talk about scars in the back, that's one of them, which is learned the hard way, is those are usually not a close plan. Those are just pipe dreams. They shouldn't be in the pipeline, right? That's kind of the area. So hopefully, through those questions, we uncover a lot of those hidden challenges, and really make that and really take some action ahead of time. Because again, time is limited, right? We've got 13 weeks a quarter, 52 weeks a year. there's only so many things we can do to affect change and to bring that deal in. So earlier, the sooner we are asking the right questions, we're getting the teams to focus, getting the client's commitment, the sooner it is that we can bring those deals in and remove those roadblocks.
With that in mind, and I like your point about, it's not quite so systematic that you can have it, almost built into a pipeline review, for example, where it's like, you're going through your 5 whys or however many you've got. Evidently, it's obviously going to be on a case by case basis. So with that in mind, is there, of kind of the mental models that you've used in the past, is there one outside of the 5 whys which you would say has been, the easiest to implement, but has had the largest impact on how your teams have performed and how they're closing deals?
So one of them, again, it's very basic, very simple. It's called first principles, which is borrowed from Aristotle's metaphysics and the Indian school of Nyaya, the philosophy. A lot of words, but what does that really mean? It means there's a foundation of a building. It's the lowest atomic level detail. So first principles means get to the lowest basics, common basics. I'll give you another analogy. So difference between a chef and a cook. So the chef is the one who creates the recipe. So he's got all these different items, and he creates a brand new recipe by taking onions and tomatoes and this and that, all the different spices, and he creates a brand new recipe. So that's first principles. That's taking all the basics and creating something from first principles. The cook, on the other hand, takes that recipe and produces food, and basically maybe with some minor mods or tweaks. That's the difference. So you're really getting into the basics of everything. You're boiling it down. So there's nothing, because typically we live by analogy. That's easy, because if we live our entire life by first principles, we will probably go back to the Stone Age, right? So we have to live by analogy. We have to move fast, but certain times you have to go back to the basics. And a similar, analogy, I would say, and then I'll give you an example, is what they do in finance with zero-based budgeting. So typically, what does that mean? In typical budgeting, let's say somebody has a budget of 40 million this year. They'll go back next year and say, okay, I need 5 million more because of whatever. They provide a business case. The company will say, okay, I'll give you 4 million. Here you go. Done. Happy. In zero-based budgeting, this year it's 40 million. Next year, they want another 5. They have to go back and start from zero, and they have to justify every single dollar from 0 to 45. So it's no longer the difference, but everything. You start from zero, and that creates, obviously, it's very time consuming. It's painful, but it puts the discipline back on every single line item. So how do we use that in sales? Many years ago, about a couple of decades ago, we had a situation where our growth slowed for some bizarre reason. We were still growing, but not at the pace at which we were expecting. The market, everything, it was just very, very different. We were winning some deals, but we were losing a lot of deals. The deal momentum slowed. And we did all the usual forensics of pipeline analysis and looking at deal structures and commercials and all of the stuff you can imagine. Again, it was a very high level by analogy. Then we said, okay, and we didn't call it first principles, but that's what we did. But as we said, it's just putting a name to it. What we did was we locked ourselves in a room for 2 days, and we said, okay, let's look at the entire market, the whole TAM for the market. Where are the customers? Let's look at the top 100 customers. What is their spend? So we went back to basics, back to the lowest atomic level detail. We looked, what are their spend? Okay, each one of them. What percentage of their revenues? Who are the competitors in there? What is their, what is their footprint? We looked at all of that. Then we looked at our territory. How are we serving those clients? And then we said, instead of tweaking it, we just said, throw everything out of the window. If we were to start a brand new company, how would we assign territories to these set of customers? And we did that. And then we said, okay, it's territories, sub-territories, areas. We did all of those mapping. And then we said, okay, now if we were to align our people to each of these territories to serve those end clients, how would we do it? Looking at each of the client directors and salespeople's background, their industry relevance, their ability to sell certain solutions, products, and we did an entire pivot. And thankfully, this was just about the beginning of the new fiscal year for us. So we did that. And so you see now we took the entire playbook and changed it. And we started from ground zero, and we did all this in a ground up manner. And that became our structure for the new year. At the end of that particular year, we grew 150%. And the simple reason for that is now we were better aligned. It was not magic. We were better aligning the reps to the right territories, to the right accounts. And then we did a look back, and what we found, Lee, was we were leaving a lot of money on the table because we were over pivoting on a few rock stars that had a few great accounts. And guess what happened? They closed some large deals, but they had only certain bandwidth. So a lot of those other accounts were going unserved. And then we had focused a lot of people into areas where it was not their core competency. So we were not aligning the right reps to the right territory, to the right accounts. It just happened over time. This happens in any organization. Over time, there is minor tweaks because that's what you do every year. You tweak a little, you tweak a little, you tweak a little. But at some point, you have to go back to first principles. We say going back to basics, same thing, where you put everything on the table, start with the lowest atomic level detail and build it up.
It's a beautiful example, and I think as you kind of went through it, it resonated a lot with me because I think from a decision making perspective, it often, and in particular, as we have a lot of operations leaders on the podcast as well, often it's a conversation around the devil's in the detail, and you're looking at all of the data in front of you, and sometimes it's so valuable actually taking a step back and really genuinely stepping away from it. And I love the idea of literally starting almost from the beginning, right? Of taking everything that you've learned. And it's often a question that I ask is, knowing what you know now, what would you do differently if you had the opportunity to start again? And it's amazing to hear the example that you've shared there in terms of how you can actually start to apply that to sales teams. Because often you can end up so far, with your head down the rabbit hole of trying to work out what on earth is wrong with this. And actually, sometimes it's better to, keep it simple and look at how you can, if you were to start again, the impact that you can make. So with that in mind, would you say that is one of the, I guess, the easier ones to implement? And probably a better way of putting that is, if you knowing what you know now, and obviously you're at ServiceNow at the minute, if you were going into a new business, is there a mental model that you perhaps use from the very beginning? Say you were joining a new company where it's, this is going to be one of the key founding principles of the team that I build.
Yeah, no, listen, I think the first principles is always good. And what it does is, it forces discipline, and it forces us to stare at the problem long enough. Right. The other one, which, we like to steal from different sciences, one from mathematics, is there was an 18th century mathematician called Carl Jacobi, and he solved some very tough, complex equations and problems using something called inversion. And his term was invert, always invert. I'll share that in a minute. A big fan of that is also Charlie Munger, who was Warren Buffett's partner. And he uses that model quite a bit. So some great minds using these models. So what it really means, Lee, is you look at a problem, like I'll give you Charlie Munger's example. He says, when you make an investment, that's what his business is, makes investment. You look at it and say, okay, typically you want that investment to grow and give you massive returns. That's generally the idea. But you look in the inversion principle and say, okay, you made an investment, and over time you play this forward, and that investment massively failed. It went to zero, or you lost a ton of money. Now what you do is you invert back. You work backwards and say, why did that fail? Okay, so it's a very different way of saying. So let me give you an example of how we use that in revenue and sales. So typically, and by the way, the caution is we should not be using this a lot of times. This should be used sparingly. And the reason is because it's got that negative connotation. Generally in sales, we're very positive, right? All of us in sales and revenue, we want to hit the target. We want to close the deals. We want to deliver maximum value to our customers and all of that. So it's beautiful. So that's how generally sales forecast, deal reviews all go. Everything is about, okay, here's the 5 steps or 6 steps or 10 steps that I'm doing from now till deal close. Beautiful. Great. No problem. That's all rose-colored glasses. But now, a few years ago, and I'll give you an exact example so that'll tell you how we used it versus just talking in abstract. So a few years ago, we were working on what was the largest deal of our company at the time. And it was going to be the make or break for all of us, for the company, for the quarter, for the year. And so we did all the right things. As you can imagine, we had all of these deal reviews, forecasts, all those things. We've checked everything, checked the boxes, all those things. Then we said, okay, let's spend some time and think about all the reasons why the deal would not get done. And then let's work backwards. So very hard to do, right? Because you generally don't want to think negative. You want to think positive. You want to say yes, yes, yes. But that's what we did. We said, okay, let's assume it's December 31st or Jan 1, end of the fiscal year. The client says, nope, no deal, done. Why would they say no? So then we said, okay, one reason would be the chief sponsor would say, I'm not in agreement. I'm not in alignment. Why? Because they've not been bought in. Okay. What can we do now? So that's the exercise. What can we do now to prevent that and to convert that and have the person say yes? Okay. We need to have our exec sponsor talk to their exec sponsor and make sure there is that alignment. Have we done that? Yes, we did that. They had a call 5 weeks ago. Okay, but are we really confident that sponsor is going to say yes? Maybe not. What can we do? Let's align another call in 4 weeks and make sure that our sponsor presents the business case again and make sure they're in complete alignment and to really check the box. Okay, great. Let's do it. Next line item. Why would they say no even if the chief sponsor says yes? Okay, they've got 14 people in their committee. And this is a very large deal, which means every one of the 14 must say yes. One person says no, deal's off. That's how important this deal is, or how big the business is. Okay, do we have confidence? Now it's the internal team talking. Do we have confidence that each of the 14 are going to say yes? Everybody looked at each other, say yes, 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 yes. But 2 people, we're not sure. We don't know. Now, this is a safe space, right? Because, so Lee, what I'm saying is this is a safe space. We're all now debating, discussing. So it's all mental games now. So everybody's very open. So 2 of them, we have some challenges. We're like, we're not sure. So what do? Line up those calls. Okay, done. Then the next item is a value assessment. Are we business value? Why would they say no? They would say no if they don't believe our solution will deliver the exact business value that we think or we have shared with them. And what do we do if that happens? Or what do we do to reverse it? Well, we have to make sure they are convinced of the business value. They're so convinced that they're excited to sign the deal. They want to get this deal done. Are we really sure they're excited? Well, everybody's like, listen, we did a great business value assessment. We delivered this. I said, no, it's not about we. It's about them. What about, are they fully on board? Well, here's the 2 steps. We provide them a business value assessment. Guess what happens? They take that and they put their internal financials, which we're not privy to, and then they share that internally. So how confident are we that in that process, they do end up with a very strong business case? Well, we've heard a few things. People have said it's okay. Don't worry about it. Are we fully sure? No. So what do we do next? Let's go back to our champions. And while we don't have privy to the internal financials, and we don't have to, can we test that again to make sure, are they missing anything? Is there anything else they need? For example, have we shared with them the specific benefits another customer of ours have received, which is in the same industry as them? Because that's the closest proxy we can find. While we can't get into their financials, we can share with them another customer, same industry. Here's what they've received and delivered. Okay, let's check that. So what we did was, coming out of that meeting, Lee, we had 5 or 6 things that, because of the inversion principle, we said, okay, we looked at the worst case, and then we said, here are all the things we need to do. We did all that over the next 30 to 60 days. And eventually, I'm happy to report that we did close the largest deal in the history of our company. And, were all the steps required? I don't know. But I'm not going to, put anything to chance on a very large deal like that. So that's the reason why I say this is not something we can use in every single deal. That would be time consuming. It would bring a lot of complexity. But in very large deals, very significant deals, critical deals, strategic deals, a great exercise to change our thinking, because we're always thinking it from a positive direction, which we must. But this inversion principle forces us to think about it in a different connotation and then work backwards and then change the course of trajectory so that we get the different result.
It's the thing that really stands out to me from that is you mentioned around the complexity of it, and I'm really keen to get into another mental model, which is Occam's razor, which goes along this very much the same principles. But just before we move on to that, with regards to the inversion theory, so how do you choose then, when to apply it? Because as you say, you use it on, what was potentially going to be the biggest deal in the company's history. So for anyone that's kind of listening at home going, okay, that sounds great. I'm going to apply it to every deal that I've got in my pipeline right now. How would you go about going, okay, let's use it? Is it just on the value of the deal, or perhaps on the complexity of it?
I think it's 2 things. One is, for sure, very high value deals. Personally, I always use it, even if it is in my own head, trying to understand the questions you ask, right? So a lot of the questions that come out are from the reverse engineering. So absolutely, very large deals, critical deals, we must do it. The other is when there are multiple stakeholders, very complex deal, global, which has many different areas. For example, multi-business unit deals where there's a lot of different business units. And what it really does, Lee, is it gives us the blind spots. It shows us the blind spots, but it is very time consuming, which is why I would suggest we should not be using this for every single deal, because also the challenge is, if you're using it every day, every time, the tone of the thinking, because we're all thinking in certain energy levels, it becomes very negative. So you don't want that. So it's really to be used sparingly, just like salt or sugar, right? Just use it a little bit, but very powerful, extremely powerful. And once you use it, I think you can use some of those questions in pretty much every deal. But the process itself is very time consuming, and that's how I would do it.
So something that I really am quite curious to dig into, we've talked a lot about these models, and I'm going to make an assumption to the listeners at home that some people are like, resonating with, oh yes, I've used that before. But, to the point you made earlier, when we were talking kind of pre-show, I found the same thing. Whereas, I have heard of this, I know about it through my own experience, but never actually put a name to it. So I can tell that obviously you're really passionate about understanding mental models and how you start to apply them. So for someone that, this may be the first time they've heard of mental models, or they've never thought of actually applying it to their day to day, how would you recommend that they, get started perhaps understanding them, but also starting to use them in their general day to day? Because I get the impression from talking to you that it's not as simple as, yes, you can just take it and just plonk it into this way of working. I get the sense that it's really your experience that has built up this level of understanding, and it's very much a case of, knowing which one to use at the right time.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a good point, Lee. So for me personally, I've enjoyed reading across the different sciences and trying to pick up the nuances and apply it to my field. That's just been a personal passion of mine. However, as you said, a lot of these principles are not necessarily rocket science or something which you have to learn. You have to recognize that that's the critical thing. And the second thing is we have to apply it and see how it works. Now, as I said at the start of the show, these are not laws. These are principles and guidelines. What does that mean? It means it's not going to work every single time. It is showing us the way, just like a map would. But what if there is a road closure? Then we're not going to say the map is wrong. We just go do a little bit of a detour and go around it. So the way I think people should think about it is it's good to take some of these, practice it, and use it in our day-to-day lives in revenue and sales. And typically this comes in kind of several forms, sales process, sales methodology, deal negotiation. So try some of these things in our day-to-day aspects. And what you'll find is, the more and more we're using it, our teams are begin to adapt. And who cares about the name? These names are all just there. Like they're good to talk about it. But the key thing is if we can use it in our day-to-day lives and create a better result and outcome for us and our clients, I think that is proof of the pudding.
Okay, so which one do you use most day to day?
We've talked about the first principles, the 5 whys, use that quite a bit. And then there's another one you alluded to, Occam's razor as well, which is quite interesting, sort of a bizarre name and term, but if I can quickly explain that, if that makes sense right now. So the name is Occam's razor. Occam is a place, as you know, in your neck of the woods in Surrey, England. And so this was the William of Occam in the 14th century. So this is about 700 years ago. He was a Franciscan friar and philosopher. And this is also called the law of parsimony. So a lot of big words and mumbo jumbo. What does all that mean? It's very simple, actually. So like a razor, Occam's razor is like a philosophy razor. It shaves off all of the obfuscation. And what he says is, of all of the different, if there are 2 or more explanations to get to an endpoint, use the one which has the simplest assumptions. Not the easiest, but simplest assumptions. And the law of parsimony is basically, parsimony means being very frugal about your resources, and using it in a very concise manner. So I'll give you 2 examples of how we use it, how we can use it in revenue and sales, this precise principle. So the first one is, again, very obvious. It's about time constraints or resource constraints. We all have resource constraints. There's limited budget, limited number of people, limited time. So what it says is we should be ruthlessly prioritizing our quarter, our month, our year, and doing the things that will help us advance our cause, right? Very basic, very, very fundamental, but makes a big difference in sales, where an account exec may have 10 accounts to go after. Where does he or she prioritize? Very, very critical, because you don't have time to go in and prospect all 10 accounts. As an example, you have to be very prescriptive on where you prioritize your time. Once you lock into that account, multiple business units, multiple stakeholders, where do you prioritize your time? Another lens to look at it is you've got marketing budget, campaigns. You can spray and pray and hope something works, but how do you really focus that into a specific business unit or account? So that's really what the law says, the law of parsimony, which is being very prescriptive. Again, nothing that we don't know, we know about it, but the challenge is sometimes we get so busy in the urgent work, the important work takes a backseat. So it's a good thing for us to keep in mind as to why, what that is important. I'll give you a second, sort of example, which is, let's say we have, again, I'll take an example of a deal, but then it can go across anything. So let's say we're talking with internally. let's just say we're talking with our team to say, okay, this is a particular deal. It's going to come in this quarter. And so we say, okay, what are some, why would it come in? Okay, because what are some key things? We'll go through the same list: exec, sponsor, alignment. If the answer is yes, okay, then shave off, just like the razor shaving off. So you've got 10 or 15 things why the deal should close, and you're going through each line by line, and you're shaving off the things that are done. So second one, maybe, have we done a business value assessment? Yes, shave that off. Have we provided them with a reference account that they can talk to and really, it makes sense? Okay, done. Have we presented? Are we on with procurement? Have we provided the right pricing? Is there any objection? The answer is yes, there's an objection. So leave that on the board. And so we go through those 10 or 15 different items that need to be done to close the deal. We shave off all the ones that are done, and only the ones that are remaining are the ones that really need to happen in order to close the deal. So Occam's razor basically tells us that if you take off all of these things that have to have happen to close the deal, then you're in good shape. Otherwise, there's more work to be done. Again, very simple, straightforward. We all do it. It's just how we apply that in our day-to-day lives. Otherwise, the challenge is we're looking at deals, we're talking about it, we're asking questions, but if we don't have that list, for example, it's hard to tell whether we've checked all the boxes, or are there any surprises? Because a lot of times, Lee, there are deals are like organisms. They have a life of their own, right? That's why sales is an art and a science. And sales process and methodology have certain steps along the way that must be done to move to the next stage, right? Every company has got that. But there are certain underlying dependencies that are not very obvious till you go through this process. And that's what some of these frameworks help us tap in early. The challenge is if you find that out at the 11th hour, when the procurement says, no, I'm not really in agreement because of A, B, and C, not a whole lot you can do other than massively discount, which you don't want to do, right? So if we're able to catch that early, then you're able to do certain things where you preserve the value of the deal and you're still able to close that in the requisite time.
Mm. Something that you mentioned there, which really stood out to me, was sales being an art. And I think it's a really interesting debate between sales being an art and sales being a science. And I know from various different guests that we've had on the podcast, there's definitely people on both sides of the fence. So with Occam's razor in mind, what would you say are, to keep things simple, what are some of the foundational procedures, processes that you run with your teams to, one, to keep it simple, but that you believe are essential? Because I think there's a balance between the two, of it being an art and it being a science. And I've talked to some people who make, the most crazy, complex systems, which are so hard to implement. And then I've spoken to other, super successful leaders that keep it so simple. It's almost amazing that it works in a way, right? So with that in mind, from your perspective, one, where do you toe the line? And two, what would you say are some of the foundational things that you do as your teams to make sure that they're set up for success?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, here's the idea, which is you have to have a strong process. That's absolutely critical. Doesn't matter if it's a 5-person company or a 50,000 person company or 500,000 person company. Process is absolutely critical. Why? Because you need repetition. As Tony Robbins says, repetition is the mother of skill. So you need to have that repeatable process, which has been fine-tuned. And this is the beauty of this, which is you learn from experience. You fine-tune it. Back to what I was talking about with the first principles. You need to have that process really, really fine-tuned. And I use that 3 or 4 times because it's not a process that you build and you say, great, you got a sales process, which means, moving from stage A to B to C, or every company's got their own, so I won't get into all the names and stages, but you know what I mean. The methodology and the process, it has to be consistent, number one, because then everybody can speak the same language. So if I say stage 5, everybody knows what it is. If I say I've moved from, expect to commit, everybody knows what that is. So the language, semantics, very important. The second part of that, Lee, is it needs to be refined because it's like an organism. Everything, it's malleable. We grow old, we learn, we get energetic certain times. We are, and so same thing in a sales organization. It's malleable. It's got a life of its own. It breathes. So you have to adapt, you have to change, you have to fine tune, you have to tweak it. That's the science part of it, which means it is a constant refinement. There's no process, there's no methodology that you put that in there and it'll work forever. It has to be, and the frequency one can debate. Is it every year? Is it twice a year? Who knows? It depends on how often you see the process diverging from the mean. You bring it back, right? So that's critical. So that you need to keep a close eye on the process, the methodology, and refining that to adjust, to tweak it. Because again, why do you adjust it? It's based on how the organization's moving, how the deals are being shaped, how it's being won or lost. So that's the process. So I'm a big believer in process. That's the science part of it, 100%. And then, the art part of it is the human relationships, right? Because that's the emotion, the feeling part of it. And that is something on both sides. One is with our teams to motivate the team, to get the team at peak performance. And then also with the ecosystem partners. You're working with partners, you're working with end clients, with the customer. That is the emotional part. That is something which is, there are certain foundational principles, but I believe there is a certain art around it, and how to, where to over pivot on science and art. That itself is an art, and that's sort of what I would categorize it. But very high on metrics. So you definitely need to run an organization on metrics, on methodology, people, process, technology. It's a very nice blend there. And so that's kind of how I would summarize it, Lee.
Amazing. Sunny, I want to ask one final question, and we've talked a lot about mental models, so I feel like I might have a sense of what your answer might be to this. However, if there is one book that you could recommend to other revenue leaders, what would it be? Because I know you are an avid reader, particularly of nonfiction. So, what would you say?
There are several, so many. The one that I would, just in the interest of, because I love to read across different disciplines and domains, and bring some of those insights. And it's, again, no dig against the sales and revenue. There's tremendous books on sales and revenue that I also read, but a lot of your listeners would already know that. So something outside the norm, which I would highly recommend, is a book by Howard Marks. Howard Marks is the founder of Oak Tree Capital Management. It's $165 billion assets under management. So guy knows what he's doing. One of the very big investor, made tons of success in his life and all that. His book is called The Most Important Thing. And in the first chapter, on the first few chapters, he talks about another mental model that I'll give you in a quick second here. He calls it the second order thinking. And in his business, what he says is, if everybody knows the news, the price is already baked in the stock. Right? Very simple. If you know Ford is coming up with a great car, and everybody knows about it, everybody's excited. Guess what? Everybody's buying that stock. The stock goes up. There's no point in, Howard says, there's no point in me buying that stock because it's already baked in. So what are some things I can do, which is Howard, he says about himself, that I can do that nobody knows? And what are some insights that I can come up with, which nobody has thought about, nobody has the time, nobody wants to invest the time. That's what he calls a second order thinking. So first order thinking is what most people do. So that's the reason I like that philosophy in that book. Is the same thing. Is a lot of times in our revenue, in our deals, we know all the steps that go along the way to get that, to make that happen. What are some things that nobody's thinking about? So, for example, if we're going into a new market, if we're moving from a product to a platform, having from one product to multiple products, that's a big second order thinking. So, what are all the things that we need to do in order to get there? Meaning, do we have the right staff? Do we have the right team members? Do we have the right solutions? Do we have the right people that we're talking to, customers? All of that changes. So a long answer to your question, but that's a book I would highly recommend. Very different discipline, but the principles that he talks about are applicable to all of us in our business.
Amazing. It's going on my reading list. That sounds fantastic. Sunne, it's been so good to have you on the podcast. For everyone listening at home that wants to learn a little bit more from you, where can they find you?
I'm on LinkedIn, and I'll shoot you the link there. I don't use Facebook or any other social media. I'm on Twitter as well.
Amazing. We'll put links to both down into the show notes, so everyone can reach out, connect, and hear more about what you're talking about with mental models. Sunne, thank you so much again. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you on, and to everyone that's listened to this week's episode, thank you so much, and we'll catch you next week.
Thank you so much, Lee. You've been awesome.
Thank you.